My name is Annette Chan. I'm the 6th generation descendant of the fishing village. So here's a picture of my great-grandmother, Maymar, and this is my grandmother, Daisy here. And so at this station, I'm going to talk to you about how the people in the village made a living fishing. So most of the fishers were men, but women also fished. The fishers worked for 8 fishing companies, 5 at Point Alonis, 2 at Pescadero, and 1 at Point Lobos. So they fished for and collected all kinds of sea life. So here's a partial list of what they caught. The fishers used set lines, trawl lines, and gill nets to do their fishing. So I'll show you that. They also did hand fishing. With abalone, they would pry them off of the rocks using short, flat iron bars. The boats that they used were usually flat-bottom sampans. So let me give that to you. So these were perfect for Monterey Bay because their flat bottoms allowed the fishermen to fish closer to shore in the shallower water. And also, they were able to pull the boats out onto land at the end of the day. After catching the fish, the Chinese would dry, pickle, and salt them for shipment to dealers in San Francisco, who then distributed them throughout California and also to China. When drying fish, smaller fish were basically spread out flat on racks or on the ground, and larger fish were split open, salted, and then hung by their tails from poles. With abalone, the villagers sold the dried meat and the shells, which were used for things like buttons and jewelry. They sold abalone shells to places like New York, France, Germany, and also China. And they sold them as souvenirs for people who visited Monterey. So by the turn of the century, the Chinese made about $200,000 per year, which would be about $7.7 million today. The Chinese started the commercial fishing industry in the Monterey area, and from around the 1850s to the early 1870s, they basically had a monopoly over the commercial fishing industry in this area. Now, Portuguese whalers had already started arriving in the area in 1854, and 1874, Italian fishermen started arriving. So in the late 1870s and early 1880s, the Chinese fishermen had more and more confrontations, disputes with Italian fishermen and the Portuguese whalers. So in order to decrease confrontations with the Italians and Portuguese, the Chinese then concentrated on squid fishing during the times of the year when the squid would come to this area by the millions to spawn. And so because the Italians and the Portuguese fished during the day, they didn't conflict with the Chinese who caught squid at night. So in order to catch squid, the Chinese would suspend a pan or wire basket containing burning pitchwood so they would have burning pine wood or pitch over the water with a long pole. And then the light from this attracted the squid, and then the fishermen would then encircle it with a net in order to catch the squid. Now bigger squid were dried and shipped to San Francisco. Smaller squid were dried and then packed in barrels alternating with salt. So at that time, in the late 19th century, the Chinese had a monopoly over salt in China. They put a very high tax on it. And so because of this, when the Chinese in China received this, they would take the squid out and use it as fertilizer, but they'd also use the salt. And so in fact, salt was actually a major commodity that was being shipped out of the Point Alonis fishing village at that time. Now during this time, Monterey provided over 90% of California's dried squid. Now all of this dried squid and fish, you can see a picture here, basically produce a terrible odor that you could smell for miles. So you can imagine this would stretch from here all the way to Ocean View. That's how much fish there was. And so the residents of Monterey and Pacific Grove would complain about the smell, and they even passed petitions about it. And so bad smell from this drying fish and squid was one of the factors that eventually led to the end of the fishing village. So anyways, that's my talk. There's a little bit of dry squid there if you want to try. We also have hand sanitizer there if you want to do that. And of course, after that, you can move over to station number 2. If you have any questions, then let me know. I think we're up on time. Is that right? Yeah, okay. All right, thank you.
Very good.
You clean your hands if you want to try some squid, and then move over to station 2.
Here we have a picture from the 1890s. It's of this particular section right here, and you can see there were a number of huts lined up along the beach. Now, over the land portion, most of the huts were going 40 by 12 feet, long and narrow, but the people along the coast were able to extend their property out with stilts over the rocks. And what's funny is nothing seems to be attached. There's no anchor points that we could see. And this particular rock right here is the one that we still have right back there. I was never able to find any way that they attached the rock, so they just braced the stilts and it sat there to the, I don't know, tidal wave came and blew it away. Here we have the beach area that was flat bottom boats. You come in with their catch, process it. Do you guys want to get a little closer? And they would process their fish and dry it on the racks out here. They dried for a couple of weeks, then they pack it in salt. They send it out to China, and San Francisco. That's it. The next display is a census for 1900. There were 171 villagers at the time. You get out of your shot. And out of this, we were able to identify 3 families listed, and these families were listed as husband and wife with kids. So these 3 families are represented in the displays that we have back here. Let's see, what's the makeup of this group? Oh, it's all mixed. So what we have, I should have done this better. So 171 villagers. There were 59 heads of household, and most of the heads of household are somebody is listed as somebody in control of that property, and most of the people living in any particular dwelling is a lodger, except for 6 families that we know of. And out of those 6 families, we have 59 heads of household. Thank you. 3 of the heads of households were female. They're also listed as widows and had children. So one of the amazing things is, how did they make a living? Because the men would go out fishing, and there must have been some other cottage industry somewhere in the village that they could earn a living. 93 of the villagers were male. Out of 93, 51 were listed as married, but we don't see more than a half dozen wives here. So the wives of these fishermen must be back in China, waiting for word, or waiting for money, or waiting to immigrate over on their own, or with their husbands. There were 31 villagers who were born in California. 2 of them were born in Point Lobos. They were my ancestors. The rest of them, we believe, were probably born here in the village. But that's sort of guesswork, because they don't say where they were born. Okay, we have time. Oh, no other group coming. So I get in the lengthy, boring one. There were 100. This is immigration dates. That's the date when these people came over. And in 1900, there were 140 people who were listed as immigrating, having immigrated from China or Japan. 5 of them arrived between 1851 to 1860. 21 arrived 1861 to 1870. But then in 1871 to 1880, there seemed to be a little boom in the population. And the next decade, 1881 to 1890, there was a decline in the number of villagers who had immigrated from China. And there are probably many reasons why there was a decline, but in 1882 is when the Chinese Exclusion Act kicked in, and was probably keeping a lot of laborers out of the country. What else do we have? And then out of the 10 that arrived between 1891 to 1899, there were 10 villagers. 9 of them were Japanese. And we no clue why Japanese started immigrating and settling here. Oh, okay, you guys are lucky. You have the bonus round.
Okay.
If you guys look at any of these shacks, you can get an actual living analog if you go to Point Lobos, because there's one cabin still remaining and you can go inside. It's been refurbished by the state parks, but if you wanted to see the inside of one of these shacks, that'd be the place to go. Again, that one is something like 12 by 45 feet. Okay.
You got more.
I got more time. I like to call this, divide this whole property into 3 parts. Way down there towards the aquarium, we call Main Street. It's in you'll see pictures later. It's a long, narrow street with these 12-foot cabins just lining the street. And what we have is, that runs all the way to the end of the trees there, on the other side of the boat works. And then the center part of the village has more housing, but it also has stables, sheds, and workshops. And this building is called Agassiz Building. It was built in 1918 after Stanford took over the ownership of the property. And anything on the other side of this building seemed to be barren land, except for a cemetery. The whole area seemed to be used for drying fish and squid. Yeah. Okay, nobody coming. Hopkins is situated on 11 acres of property. But back in the old days, there were no roads, no railroad, no street, and no buildings on the other side of the street here. It was all open for the Chinese to spread out their village. In fact, there was a Chinese joss house right over where the tin cannery is right now, up the hill, and old pictures you see pointing downward towards the village. What else is there? The railroad. Did anybody talk to you about the cemetery?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. They tell you they had to relocate the cemetery?
Yeah.
Okay. Because of the railroad?
Yeah.
Oh, they talked that. Okay, I can cover it. I'm done.
This is Kwok Tuck Lee's shack. This is where Tuck Lee's home is. Go ahead, take a seat if you want. Get comfortable. I got 5 minutes with you. So Tuck Lee's house does not burn down when the village burns down in 1906. Tuck Lee is a U.S. citizen. Born with Kwok Moi and Kwok Shi. You'll learn about Kwok Shi from Nancy Wong, your great-great-grandmother. He knows Chinese, he knows English, he knows Spanish, he's registered to vote, right? And he's the go-to guy. He's been here probably since the 1870s, 1880s. And Hopkins Seaside Laboratory gets established at Lumberton Point at 1892. And I'll turn this way so you can all sit down and listen to me. Tuck Lee is the go-to guy for specimens. Specimens of interest for the Stanford University scientists, Hopkins Seaside Laboratory. David Starr Jordan, first president of Stanford University, mentions this. And so I'm starting to do the history of Hopkins Seaside Laboratory, and this guy, Tuck Lee, it's spelled different ways, starts showing up in the articles. I'm like, who's this guy? So one thing leads to another, and I get the story of Kwok Tuck Lee. He's a collector of specimens, primarily hagfish embryos. They're really interested in developmental biology of fishes at this time. David Starr Jordan writes his story up. Different faculty at Stanford mention his name. And then Bashford Dean shows up. Bashford Dean, if you put in the name Bashford Dean in your your phone right now and do Wikipedia, this guy is a character, right? He's renowned. He's a collector of military armament, along with being, a renowned ichthyologist, study of fishes. And there's probably a collection that's of his museum of military armament. It has Japanese armor, Chinese armor, armor from the Middle East. Probably at not Harvard, but Columbia. Well, if you look a little bit further and you look for collections and hagfish embryos and hagfish, you find this other wonderful collection at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University. This has just recently been uncovered by some of the students up at main campus. One student went visiting there asking questions. She brought back these wonderful photographs of Bashforddine's collection of specimens that he got, various sequences of the development of this hagfish embryo at Harvard, and they're renowned collection to this day. They're referred to as this day, but now they're more and more being associated and recognized as Tuck Lee being the gentleman who collected these specimens. And Bashfordine thanks him immensely in several of his papers related to the research that he did on these hagfish embryos, right? So now I'm going to tell you another story about Kwok Tuck Lee. Now, there's a couple photographs around here somewhere, I think. Right. So these are two photographs. One is of Tuck Lee, right? And you can pass these around. Another one is of Tuck Lee, his wife, Kwok Mary, and two of his three daughters. So the story goes, we always thought there was three daughters, that the more I get into the story, there's the story of two sons. And one of those two sons is Kwok Fat. And they don't show up in any of the censuses for here, but it comes to light as we're doing a study, trying to understand Kwok Tuck Lee, and Kwok Fat goes over to China to find a wife. And then he tries coming back, and he finds trouble getting back into the country because they're asking, is he truly a U.S. citizen? Kwok Fat's like, oh yeah, I am a U.S. citizen. I am a U.S. citizen. My father is Kwok Tuck Lee. He's born in Monterey, one of the earliest born. I'm a U.S. citizen. All hell breaks out. I have 1 minute to tell you the story. All hell breaks out, right? Who is this guy? Is he truly a U.S. citizen, or he's just Chinese citizen? And they go down and they interview family members, Kwok Mary, and also members of the community that are not Chinese, because they want to get, find other high-level officials that could identify that Kwok Fat was truly Tuck Lee's son. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, right? We've hit the big time, right? That time, they come out with a decision whether Kwok Fat is a U.S. citizen or not. They say it's better to let a Chinese citizen into America than make the mistake of kicking out a U.S.-born Chinese citizen out of the country, right? So that's big stuff. So how did I stumble upon all this story? One day I'm doing Kwok Fat and Kwok Tuck Lee, and then Barack Obama shows up in the same lineage. I'm like, what? So remember when Barack Obama was getting all questioned about whether he was truly a U.S. citizen or not? Some of those researchers, some of those academics refer back to this story of Kwok Fat, Kwok Tuck Lee, and the U.S. Supreme Court's decision. So I think my minute is up. Before I kick you out of here and move you on, do you have any questions, comments, or concerns? None.
I didn't know there was a connection.
You didn't know that?
14th Amendment and this.
Right.
I mean, I knew about Tuck Lee.
Right.
I didn't know the connection.
If you're bored to death and you cannot sleep tonight, exhibits.stanford.edu/China Point, somewhere in there is this whole story. And a whole bunch of other stories about the Chinese fishing village, Kwok Tuck Lee, and Chin Yip, and whatever else we can do. We've been working a lot with Rod and I. What happens after the Chinese fishing village? Where does everybody go? Right? Do they settle down? And we looked and tried to figure out what's going on Canada Road. And that's a very interesting story in itself. That's my story. Sticking to it.
Thank you. Quacktutley's is that one there.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Main Street of Point Elonis Village. I'm going to talk a little bit about village life and how people were able to survive this very primitive village. The village was built mainly with untreated wood. That they were built next to each other, so there was no privacy, and it was on dirt basically. Now, some of the homes they were able to raise it with rocks, but very unstable. Now, cooking consisted of on a wood stove inside, and you notice there are no chimneys to have the smoke go out of the residences, and then no electricity meant no light, so the oil lanterns were used for light at night, one oil lantern. And of course there's no sewage system, so that meant the back of the houses faced the ocean, and that was the sewage system in those days. The women did their best to cook. They ate a lot of fish, but they didn't eat a whole lot, and that's why you notice that the population was very thin. But the men were very strong, because when they fished out in the ocean, you know, they didn't have motors either. They did it by hands and oars, but they managed to do that fishing and bring in the fishing, so that was really quite something. Now, the women during the day would dry the fish and sell it, or I think they shipped it back to China mainly for dried fish. Because I can still remember my grandmother, when we visited her, still dried fish in a little container, but at least had covering over so the flies couldn't eat the fish. There was an anti-sentiment against the Chinese. So when the village burned down, 16 businesses and a number of homes were destroyed. So the value of those homes were about $14,000. So in today's market, it's worth about $500,000. Now, during the time that the village existed, they had to pay rent to the Pacific Improvement Company. Even though the Chinese landed here and lived here, no one really owned the property, and ownership was very different in those days. So they paid $200 in rent to the Pacific Improvement Company. So there was one person that collected enough money to make up the $200 to give to the Jack's Peak, that family that began that whole era. Now, interaction with the white people, there was virtually none other than paying the rent. They would open up the village once a year during the Lunar New Year's, and so everything was cleaned up. If they wanted to buy anything, they would, because there was grocery stores and so on. When the Del Monte Hotel was built and the railroad brought in a lot of people, one of the tourist sites was this village. So it was an oddity or curiosity, so they would swing by and take pictures from afar, because obviously with the sewage system and the drying of the fish, it was not a pleasant place to be wandering around. So it was very difficult for our descendants, prior generations. My grandfather met his wife in the Pescadero Village, which is Pacific Grove. So they moved here, and then shortly after that the fire occurred and the village was completely destroyed. So the majority of the people, by the show of hands, moved to San Francisco area, and my grandfather for some reason stayed, and he continued to fish, but limited. And so they raised 6 kids in that Wave Street studio, and that's where we're having lunch. The building is designated a historical site, and it can never be destroyed, but the interior could be changed. The people who bought it raised the property to make it street level, They spent a lot of money doing that because we kind of watched it. We'd drive over here to see what they were doing to it. So at first they lived upstairs because I did have a tour of it after they finished it, and then they actually. Oh no! Oh, thank you. Oh yeah, that's gonna happen. So where they opened it up to be an event place, so they charge people so much to have events there. Of course, we're gonna have our catered lunch there. And they've been really kind, giving us a huge discount. So these pictures are showing my mother in front of Way Street with the altar, and there's a picture of me when I was single. I'm 84 years old, so this was taken like when I was 4 or 5. I can't believe these pictures existed. I just found out today, and I thought, oh my gosh. Unfortunately, I'm one of those people who don't know our family history, and I'm learning about it the last couple of years because our parents never talked about it. And we tried to interview my mother, and she just clammed up. And I'm going off script now, but because at that time it was 1941, World War II, and there was a Japanese contingent here too. And so in order to shop in the regular stores, they had these. We found this card that said, "I am Chinese," and it was embossed or something. Oh, my brother threw it away, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is historical stuff. Because otherwise they couldn't shop at various stores during that time. So there was, and there was across the street was an Italian family too, because the Italians took over most of the fishing locally. So there's some animosity there, but it's past. And so the younger generation don't seem to be interested in that, but we're going to lose all this historical knowledge. Anyway, I'm making the pitch probably to the wrong people. And I know I'm kind of, oh no. So do you have any questions? Because I kind of went over the track here. Anyway, we'll have a nice buffet Chinese food. I understand there's 23 trays of food coming. And Wave Street is on a hillside, so when we walk from here, we're going to walk in front of it on the trail and then walk up a few steps into the building. But if you take the street one, you'd have to go down a staircase to get down to where we need to be. So I would suggest you take the coastal route, because that is a steep staircase. Okay, well thank you for listening.
Thank you.
I am Nancy. Okay, this is this is the station about the earthquake and how it impacted the villages down here. So as you might have read, the San Francisco 1906 earthquake was magnitude 7.9, some say 8.25. Well, that is humongous. It was felt 300,000 square miles around this area, went as far as north as southern Oregon and farthest south as southern California, east to Nevada. So you know Pacific Grove and Monterey were definitely impacted, but it was not just the earthquake that ended up impacting our village. Now my uncle remembers running down the street, the fire chasing him, because the fire destroyed completely the San Francisco Chinatown. And there were about there were like 3,000 Chinese living on the streets. There were over several hundred that were killed, and another several hundred that just left. So my uncle's running down the street, running from the fire that's chasing them with his siblings and his parents, and they went to Nob Hill, but Nob Hill, there was no houses yet, and they said to the Chinese, you can't come up here, this is our hill. So the soldiers led them to the Presidio, which is on the coast. And while they were there, they looked out at the ocean and saw a junk boat. And they said it had to come from the fishing villages, it had to. So they flagged it down, and right away they recognized each other. They were cousins. And they had come from Point Lookout, going to San Francisco to sell the fish. Well, obviously they couldn't do that, so my family boarded, turned around, and went to Point Lookout. Now, of course, like I said, about 100 also went back to Point Alones, and the people in Monterey and in Pacific Grove were not happy about that. As you know, for decades, both locally and nationally, the political situation was trying to get rid of the Chinese. But they didn't succeed, or we wouldn't be here. So, but another 100 in Point Alones, another 100 of those Chinese, so they gathered in a mob at front of the Point Alones village, shouting, "The Chinese must go! The Chinese must go!" And soon after, maybe a day later, was the fire. And it was a suspicious fire because the tanks at the back of the village were emptied of the water. And the fire engine that came, one of the main hoses, was cut. And they did find out later that it was one of their own firemen. But before even this fire took place, the Chinese had gone to help the Hotel Del Monte find the guests' things under their rubble and then place them in a box guarded by the hotel people. But after the fire, as the Chinese are looking through there and finding things, they'd go up to the hill and they'd store them. They would be stolen, by the way. And also, that photo I passed around here, you can see white people also going through their things and keeping them. Now, because of this kind of thievery, you can pass this around if you want. Because of this thievery, they say the Pacific Improvement Company that owned the land and had a really good relationship with the Chinese, because they always paid on time, they put a fence around the village. But we don't know if that's really why, because they didn't let the Chinese in either to find their things. But now, two things did not burn down. One was Tuck Lee's house, and one was the Joss house. Tuck Lee demanded that he should be able to live in his house, so he had to jump the fence and live in his house. But he was kicked out many times, in and out of prison. But he finally was able to live there for a year before they kicked him out permanently. Now, so why are there no mansions here? If it's such good real estate, why were there no mansions? Well, no one would buy. So they offered to the UC Berkeley, but they said they didn't have the money. And then for 10 years, it sat fallow, nothing, until they finally donated it or swapped land with the Stanford's Hopkins Marine Lab and turned this into the Hopkins Marine Station. So that's why this is all here now. So where did everyone go? They couldn't live at Point Alones. Well, some, as I said, scattered, but there was a man by the name of Mr. Maccabee who offered his waterfront land for them to build another village. And that's a whole other story where they couldn't, well, as you know, I don't know if you know, at one point the law was Chinese could not fish during the day. So they ended up fishing at night, the squid. But then there's a law passed that you couldn't dry the squid anymore. So then what? They couldn't sell it if it's not dried. It would just rot wherever it was going. So they started a business with a fish emulsion, a fish fertilizer. But for some reason, that factory also burned down at Maccabee. So it's a whole other story. But so where did everyone eventually go? By 1935, there was only one Chinese fisherman left at Maccabee. So I know that Kwok Moy's family stayed here, which is why we're going to have lunch at her house. And Tuck Lee's family moved to San Francisco, started many businesses, and went back and forth because he had such a good relationship with the scientists. And my family was Sing Hing's, and she was the youngest daughter. Her firstborn was a daughter and got match married to someone in Chicago. And I just did another play by him because we were always told he died in an accident, but I swear it was murder. So I do a murder mystery about his death. I mean, how do you fall down an elevator shaft? You have to have been pushed, right? So, anyway, if you want to know more, I've now written the book, and it covers the first 3 generations and fills it out with all the ways that we survived, how we reinvented ourselves, how we, really persisted, and why we're all here today. Any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
This picture is a picture of the Monkey Rock. It's called Monkey Face Rock or just Monkey Rock. My family always referred to it as Monkey Rock. And it was a very important landmark for the community. This is where it is. This is the base of it. The top had fallen off and it's located, that big boulder over there is the top. So you see that here at the base and then the big top. This picture was from, I think 1906 was stated. So it was a landmark. My family moved this rock because their home was right next to the rock. So right in here somewhere. There's a Monterey Chinese Village, was the person who came from China. He had their 3 children. They lived out here. There's 3 children. I know that my great-grandfather was born here, and his son, my grandfather. My grandfather's brother is the one that told me that his home, the door opened right up to Monkey Rock. So it's always been an important part of our family history for that reason. And after the fire, 1906, the village burned down, but of course the rock remained. And I think this is when the village had burned down at this point, leaving the rock. Marthy Gitt family, Marthy Gitt and his wife had already passed away before the fire. They died in, I think, 1887. They were buried here at the Mission cemetery ground, the first cemetery. I think 2 or 3 years later, the railroad came through. They had to move that cemetery. But I don't know that Monty Gitt and his wife, I don't know that they were moved to the second cemetery, because our family lore said that they brought up all the remains that they could, bones and such of these people, and stored them in a can. And the can was kept like at the hearth or by their fireplace. They stayed there for I don't know how long they did that. A lot of times the Chinese would ship their remains, their bones back to China to be buried in ancestral homelands. I don't know that my family had the financial means to do that. All I know is they were kept in the cans by a fireplace, and eventually those remains were buried here at the city cemetery over by El Estero Lake. Where Dennis the Menace is and the ballpark, and there's a big cemetery there. There's a tiny section there. So that's where those remains are there. Tom Gump is there, his wife is there, my Uncle Mark is there. We have 10 graves of my family that are there. And so after the fire, the family that was burned out moved into the city of Monterey, town of Monterey. There was like a new Chinatown being built up there, as on Washington Street. You go downtown now, you go down the main drag at Alvarado. Right at the end of Alvarado, close to Del Monte. So 408 Washington is where they live. They had a little storefront out in front. Their home was in the back. I think the store was 407. They did the 408. The 4 children were born there. And I think they lived there until about so in 408, Tom Gump, he already had children from the ages of 1 to 23 were his kids. Tom's in his mid-40s by this time. And so when Tom moved there, he had yet another child. And then a couple of years after that, Tom's oldest son had a child. So there was a lot of age spread and everything. But did Tom have? Tom had it. I have to look at my family tree. I'm trying to concentrate on so many different things today. But at any rate, children were born there, and then they moved from there over to the Oak Grove area, the other side of Big Ellisburg. They moved there, and I think the 1920s. At the time, they had the little storefront on Washington. The oldest son, my grandfather, he was working for the Hotel Del Monte. And so moving into Oak Grove got it closer to work, so the whole family went there. So our time is up. Now we have time for questions, and I hope I can answer off the top of my head, Joanne. How many people, how many kids did Tom have? I think he had 6. In his National Archives, I was able to make an interview from Angel Island Archives from the Exclusion Act when they had to be interviewed. He said that there were 8 children, but 2 had died in infancy. So he did have 6 that were here. 5 which were born here, and then the one on Washington. Can I answer anything else for anyone?
This is Monkey Rock, the picture right there. This is now the base of Monkey Rock, and this is the head of Monkey Rock.
To the Chinese cemetery talk. In the late 1880s, as you know, the Point Alonis fishing village had a Chinese cemetery. Eventually, it was located in this area here. Originally, it was located way up here under this rocky point, but it was eventually, because of people wanted to use the deposits up there, they brought the cemetery down to here. So when anyone in the fishing village died, of course, there was a funeral cemetery all the way from where they did the ceremony all the way back to here where the funeral was held and people were buried. The funeral procession had loud music, and it had firecrackers to ward off evil spirits. And guests would avoid wearing red. For what reason? Red is the color of joy and happiness in the Chinese community, all around the world. So instead of red, what color did Chinese people wear for funerals?
White.
White. That is the color of death in the Chinese community. So also, there is a Chinese cultural belief that the spirits of the dead had to be fed. So therefore, people would bring food to the cemetery. Roast pig, cakes, chicken, candy would be put on the grave for the deceased. However, as Chinese people, we don't like to waste, so I suspect that after the funeral, that food was put to good use. I don't suspect it went to waste. So the Chinese followed the Confucian principle of ancestor worship, which says that the deceased must be reunited with their ancestors for their soul to find peace. Therefore, if they were buried here and their families were back in China, after a few years their bones would be exhumed and they would be put in a box and shipped back to their village in China. That ensured that the deceased could receive veneration and offerings from their family back home. Now, so there's the funeral procession, and they had firecrackers to ward off evil spirits. Many single men who came to California were unable to start families. So there's the ancestor worship. You have seen that, I'm sure, around Chinatown. You may have seen even your families have a little bit of an altar in the home somewhere where the ancestors could be worshipped. The single men who worked here, mostly single men, they came alone to California, and many were unable to start families because of the 1875 Page Act, which prevented Chinese women from coming to the United States. What was the basis of the Page Act? Why did they say Chinese women should be banned from California and the United States, basically? They were afraid that the Chinese women would come and become prostitutes rather than become family. So the single men, because they rarely could find women, were afraid that when they died, their spirits would become hungry, as well as lonely ghosts who would wander uncared for and unfed throughout the spirit world for eternity. That's why single men in America, single Chinese men, worked so very hard so they could get enough money to go back home and have their spirit buried there. Ah, thank you. That might help. We'll see. Thank you. Unfortunately, many of the single Chinese men were unable to afford to go back home because they were paid discriminatorily low wages, lower than anybody else, even though they worked just as hard, if not harder. But fortunately for them, the Chinese Benevolent Associations, this is the Chinese Six Company in San Francisco, they raised funds for exhumation of single men's bones to be sent back to China, where they could be cared for by the deceased person's family. However, in 1888, the Southern Pacific Railroad wanted to build an extension west of the Monterey Depot through Pacific Grove and around the point to access the sand deposits at the beach near here. So they negotiated a right-of-way with the U.S. government at the Presidio, and in 1889, construction began just west of Monterey. But guess what? Unfortunately, here, the Point Alona Cemetery was in its path. So the Chinese had to move the cemetery to where the Hopkins Marine Station is today. Literally, it sits on top of a Chinese cemetery. Many of the graves could not be exhumed and sent back, so we suspect there are a lot of our ancestors underneath the Marine Station. The cemetery remained here until the Chinese left the Point Alonas Village in 1907. Any questions? Boy, you guys are good. Let me just tell you a bit about myself since we have a moment. I'm Michael Lee. My parents were John and Ruth Wong. Many of you had seen them when they were alive. They were really big on putting together reunions of Chinese folk who had ancestors here. Our ancestors was Jenny Kwok, who came here. Her family came here on one of the first Chinese junks in about 1885. And so if you're interested in a book, let me know. There's order forms here. I'll be over at the Wave Studio for lunch if you're interested in buying a book. It's really about the Chinese experience in America, some of the challenges and everything else.